Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show, where I talk about the challenges that IT professionals face when working with high availability and disaster recovery solutions. And I'm not just particular about SQL Server because, again, SQL Server is just one piece of the entire equation. And you can see that if you look at some of the recordings and videos that I've done in the past, I talk about some of these challenges because most of the time we're more fixated on the technology than on the process and the people aspect of it. And this is where I cover most of them. Now, the topic of this week's presentation or this week's episode, and I just want to put the banner out there, because of not being on the same page with HADR. You hear me talk a lot about high availability and disaster recovery as a team sport. It's not an individual show, right? It's not an individual sport. Although in some cases you might hear people say, yeah, I've done this on my own, built the entire infrastructure. But the challenge with that is, even though you built a high availability solution, you're not highly available. And the joke that I kind of tell my customers is, I may be a high availability expert, but I'm not always highly available. I like my sleep. I like to enjoy life. I like to do stuff outside of work. And the reality is, you too are not supposed to be highly available. You're not supposed to be carrying your phone 24/7 so that anybody can call you. That's why I keep emphasizing that high availability and disaster recovery in general, whether it's for SQL Server or your infrastructure or your app, is a team sport. Everybody should be on the same page as far as how you implement your HADR solution, what you do, and the process involved with high availability and disaster recovery. And there is a cost associated with it, right? I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've learned, lessons that I've learned both when I was still working as a data center engineer, as well as working with customers. And I find it interesting because I thought this was kind of unique to my customers' environment. But then you start looking at questions on forums, news groups like Stack Exchange. When people ask these questions about HA and DR, they fall into the same category where somebody would just focus on the tech and not consider what other aspects are involved in order to make this a success. Plus the fact that, of course, most people look at high availability and disaster recovery kind of like an afterthought. We're not going to think of it today. We're going to think of it down the road until they, of course, they forget about it, because now they're more focused on the operations and building infrastructures and improving database performance. So let's dive down into the content. Of course, as always, I got my notes, pen and paper, as I'm old school, right? The cost of not being on the same page with HADR. And you might be thinking, wait a second, why do I have to care about this? I'll let the business worry about it, right? Because in the long run, you are going to be affected. You are, the way you do your work will be dictated by this. And like I said, you may be the person responsible for building, maintaining, monitoring all of these things, and you're not supposed to be highly available, right? The fact that you're the only person on the team, if you are the only person on the team doing all of these things, is in itself the cost. Because what happens if, let's say, you decided you want to quit your job and you don't want to do this anymore? Now, that is a cost to the business, and it's also a cost to you when you start, I don't want to say deteriorating, because again, we're already stressed out with so many things that we need to do, not to mention taking care of high availability and disaster recovery solutions. So if, again, you're the only person on the team, you're always on call, and you're basically the only person responsible for all of these things, you're going to shut down, literally, and you don't want that. And I don't want that for you. So let's get on with the cost of not being on the same page with your HADR. And when I say not being on the same page, not being on the same page with other members of your team, other divisions of your team. And typically there's this divide between developers and infrastructure guys or database guys. But at the end of the day, everybody has to be on the same page, because there's no point in providing high availability and disaster recovery solution to a database, although that's my key area of expertise, if the app is not highly available. You don't want to build this massively complex high availability solution for your database with licensing costs and maintenance costs, not realizing your app isn't even highly available, right? So let's, again, three things. Number one, there's lack of consistency. Lack of consistency. I see this a lot when, let's say, an application developer will rely on the infrastructure people to take care of, let's say, backups. And we're talking about disaster recovery. They're the ones responsible for taking care of the backups of both the server and the database, and even the application side. Now, some people would rely on something like an enterprise-wide backup, third-party backups, where they're taking a backup of everything, not just the application, but the server. If the server is a VM, they'll take a snapshot of the VM. And there's no consistency, because from the point of view of the app developer, this is how we want the app to be backed up. Or from the point of view of the VM admins, this is how we want the VMs to be backed up. From the point of view of the database administrator, this is how we want the database to be backed up. In fact, I've seen this happen so many times. The application developers will create kind of like a regular job that would take a copy of the app, and typically it's just code. They will take a copy of the code in production, store it somewhere, and that becomes their backup. The VM guys or the infrastructure guys will have something different. All right, we're going to implement a form of a VM backup. So now the apps and the servers where the apps are running will have VMs or snapshots taken as backups. So now you're looking at two copies of the same application in two different places being the same, well, not the same, but being backed up, right? And then comes the DBA, the database administrator, who is responsible for the database, coming up with its own or his or her own way of backing up. Like, I'm going to do a native database backup solution because I want to truncate the logs, so I'm going to use transaction log backup. I want full database backup because I want to be able to restore the database from backup and not have to worry about restoring the backups from VMs and whatnot. And all of these things, all of a sudden, if you start to think about it, it adds up from the point of view of storage space. You have a copy of the app in the code that the developers took as a backup. You have a copy of the VM, which also has a copy of the app, and then you have the database. So you're now multiplying the storage requirements in order for you to even restore something. Now, there's nothing wrong if you can actually restore it. More often than not, different teams would have different ways of backing up their infrastructure, their app, their databases, to a point where when the time comes to actually do a restore, they don't even know which one to rely on. Do we rely on the app? Oh, wait a second. If I restore the app from the code we copied, it's just the app. We don't have a database. Oh, and by the way, if the database only has the data and the app has scattered different data, like for instance, the metadata of the app, configuration of the app is stored in the database. So is that now consistent with how the app should look like at the point in time? It doesn't make sense. But like I said, this is the first cause, is the lack of consistency. And again, not to mention even testing restore. How many people actually test the restores? And I know it's a little bit dramatic, but I emphasize that for a fact, because everybody who claims to have a backup, if you ask them, very few actually test their restores on a regular basis. Very few. So now you don't even know how consistent your backup is from the point of view of the app, from the point of view of the VM, from the point of view of the database. So you now have three different points of view when you're restoring. So now, are we looking at a consistent point in time when we're restoring the backups? Which backup? Which point in time? How do we know it's consistent? And this is, again, one of those things that you have to consider, because there's no consistency, right? Not everyone's on the same page. And the way I look at it is I bring everybody on the team on the same page when it comes to HA and DR. I just gave an example of a DR solution. What about for HA? The HA also has to take into account both the app, the infrastructure, and the database. It's not just the one thing. I couldn't count the number of times when DBAs would spend so much time, effort, not to mention licensing cost, hardware cost, and time building something. And then when you ask them, so what about the app? They've not looked at the app because for them, they're only focused on what they need to work on, which is the database side. Same thing with the infrastructure guys, right? I'm not singling out these people because, again, it happens to everybody, even the app developers. Sometimes the app developers don't even think about scaling out for HA as part of their design. All they care about most of the time is it has to work, and it has to work yesterday. I'm pointing that out because I used to be a developer. That was the only thing that mattered to me back then. I need to make it work, and it has to be working yesterday. Time crunch, time constraints. I need to roll out code in production ASAP, right? So I'm not even thinking about HA and DR, right? So that's the first thing, the lack of consistency. And there's this risk of implementation, and I've seen it happen as well, where because of this inconsistency, it's actually causing more issues. One customer that I worked with had this goal of and the good thing about them is they have a recovery point and recovery time objective for both HA and DR. So they were clear on that. However, they were clear on that from the database side only. So they were doing the database backups. They were running regular log backups so that they could do point in time recovery. Plus, at the same time, it's a way for them to manage transaction logs. Well and good, and they tested it well and good, fine. But then there's the app side. The application developers are not even aware that there's this thing that is happening, that the database is being backed up. So they had their own way. They built their own mechanism to, I used the example earlier, taking a copy of the directories or the folders where the app code is, copying that. But because their configuration settings, their metadata is stored in the database, they also built a mechanism where they would extract that value or those values from the database, dump it on an XML file, and that's their backup. See, that's the thing. The way their backup works is not consistent with how the database backups work, right? If they need to restore, they don't know which one they need to believe in. Because again, there might be configuration settings that have changed. There might have been metadata that has been modified, and it's not in the same consistent state as when the database was backed up. Although, of course, the DBAs would say, yeah, we trust our database backups because we're doing point-in-time recoverability with transaction log backups. But the thing is, again, if they have not even tested it, they don't know if it's going to be consistent. And I haven't even mentioned the VM backups, because the VM backups are actually doing VSS integration backups to a point where the VM backups are breaking the log sequence chain of the databases. Because again, from the database administrator's point of view, this is my database maintenance plan. This is taking database backups, transaction log backups. At the back of his head, when he's doing a restore, this is all he needs. Not true. Because if there's another backup happening under the covers, maybe it's through an app, or in this case, it's through a VSS integration with the VM, that breaks the log sequence chain of the database maintenance plan they created, right? And again, they're not even testing. They have not even tested this. So they're just operating on the fact that, hey, may or may not work, right? And that's a cost, because you don't want to be in a situation where you actually need to recover, but you cannot because you haven't even tested whether or not your backups work. So that's the first one. I know I've spent so much time on this because, again, there's just a lack of consistency, which then translates into potential problems. And again, most people don't see it as a potential problem because it hasn't happened yet. And one of the reasons I like working on emergencies is because this is when people are now putting a lot of effort and attention into something because something was broken, right? That's one of the reasons I like working on emergencies. I can easily get people's attention because it is an emergency. All of a sudden, we now have budget for implementing a solution. We now have people. We now have the time, right? I just like taking advantage of emergencies. So that's number one, lack of consistency. Number two is the inadequate planning and preparation, right? Inadequate planning and preparation. Again, I'm subdividing the different teams to developers, infrastructure guys, and the DBAs. I gave that example earlier where the DBAs would come up with their own database maintenance plans, taking backups, and then running their own schedule and not even asking the other teams about it. And this is where, when you, again, going back to what I mentioned, if we need to recover from a point in time, how sure are we that everything is going to be consistent? Because the DBAs want to have their own way of doing database backups, right? Again, lack of consistency, the first one. The second one is inadequate planning. They'll just go ahead. And then most of the time, and here's the thing, we want to cover our backs. We want to make sure that we're protected. So we do our best to test our best. Meaning, from the point of view of the DBA, sure, give me a server, I'll restore the backups. Everything's fine. But we never bothered asking about how the application would connect to the database, validate whether or not the data is consistent, and everything is consistent up to that point in time, right? We don't even look at those. And this lack of planning and preparation is like multiple projects happening at the same time. The database guys are doing their own thing. The application guys are doing their own thing. And because of that, sometimes, again, just like the example that I mentioned earlier, it just happens and now everybody's disconnected, meaning they're literally not on the same page, but everybody's disconnected. So one team's doing something and the VM guys or the infrastructure guys are doing something, and then the database guys are doing something. So now it's all over the place. When the business starts asking questions, or even worse, when we need to invoke, or the business needs to invoke DR, the database guys will be doing their own thing. The VM guys will be doing their own thing, which could override what the DBAs are doing. Yeah, think of it this way. Take a step back. The infrastructure guys are doing their own thing. They're taking snapshots of the VM. They're restoring the snapshots. And here are the DBAs taking care of every database backup. So imagine this. The DBAs are now restoring from backup. All of a sudden, the VM admins decide, hey, we want to restore from the VM backups. They just have overwritten everything that the DBAs did. And now we're back to square one. Well, not necessarily square one, but the point is, if the database admins were able to restore the data from, let's say, 3 hours ago, and the VM snapshot was taken at at least 4 hours ago, you just lost a lot of data because of inconsistent planning and inadequate planning, right? I've seen so many cases where the work of one team has been overwritten by the work of the other team because they're not talking together, right? That's a cost. Now the database guys will now have to do everything all over again. Think of it this way. They were able to restore the backups. Full backups took about an hour, several log backups, additional 45 minutes. So now they're done to a point in time where they could say, we're consistent, we've met our recovery objectives. And then the VM guys would restore the VM snapshot to a point where it's 4 hours before, right? So when you think about that, they just overrode everything. So now the DBAs will now have to come back and do everything all over again, right? This is very expensive and frustrating as well. Because now you're thinking those guys don't really care about what we do. And now there's animosity between teams. And that's one of the reasons why, again, they end up not communicating and not talking, right? That's the second one. And I know I might be making fun of it, but it's funny just looking at it when different teams don't talk to each other. I remember This was back in 2014 when SQL Server 2014 was recently released, and this customer decided we want to implement kind of like a active. It's not really an active implementation, more of like both data centers are primary. And the way they architected it was phenomenal. It was really great. They were taking advantage of, I think it was clustered column store indexes. So they're providing reporting to their customers and analytics. And they wanted me to look at their environment, just do a quick analysis. And I said, I sense something based on the responses they gave to my questions and how their team dynamics worked. And I said, I need to meet your team. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being on Zoom or GoToMeeting and meeting people, right? But I sensed there was something going on. And I said, I want to meet your team. I want to talk to your team. All day we're saying, well, we cannot afford your travel and accommodation. Said, I'll cover that. Went in there in the first 45 minutes of the conversation with the teams. I found out that the app developers are not talking to the infrastructure guys. The infrastructure guys are not communicating with the databases, database administrators, and everybody is stepping on to each other's toes. Well, I don't want to say literally, because they're sitting on cubicles that are literally not right next to each other, but they're not talking. And I told the director, you have much worse problems here. And the way I look at it is, every technical problem is a people problem first, manifesting as a technology problem. True, they do need somebody to look at their availability groups and the way it's implemented, but more important than me looking at their infrastructure and their database and their AGs is looking at how the teams communicate. Because if the developers, again, are not on the same page with the infrastructure guys, they might be rolling out code that may not be consistent with how the infrastructure guys are taking their backups. They might be thinking, what does that have to do with me, the infrastructure guy, taking the backups? Or what does that have to do with the DBA taking the backups? Well, again, it's all about meeting recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives, service level agreements, and everything looking consistent by the time you turn the lights on. Meaning, if you need to recover from a disaster, everything should look exactly the same and not one being inconsistent with the other. Meaning, the VM has to look exactly like how it looked like before the incident. The database needs to look exactly like how it looked like before the incident. And even the app, everything has to be consistent. And not having to worry about logical data corruption, because what the app thought should be there isn't, because the database is not consistent, right? Again, just the cost of having different teams not be on the same page as far as HADR are concerned, right? Number 3 is misaligned priorities. Misaligned priorities. And again, especially in larger organizations where you have silos. You have, again, I keep mentioning app team, infrastructure team, and database team. They have different priorities. The app team might be more concerned about, I want to focus on uptime, and I want to be able to recover. The infrastructure team might be more concerned about cost reductions. And you know how it is. If they're thinking about enterprise backups, they need to license every single server. So now we have to come up with cost reductions. One of the reasons why a lot of organizations are putting stuff on VMs. They want to reduce the cost. And reducing the cost may be a priority for the infrastructure guys. But if that's not the priority of the DBA team or the app team, they would do different strategies based on their priorities. And I always, not always, but I emphasize on the fact that you would put more effort, time, and resource on something that is a priority. Like I said, one of the reasons I like working on emergencies is because when there is an emergency, all of a sudden, the issue becomes a priority. You get all eyes on the issue. You get all ears when you start talking about how we need to resolve this, right? The application developers, the infrastructure guys might have a totally different priority. Like I said, most infrastructure people, their goal, their priority is to reduce costs. And that's why, again, server consolidation, VM consolidation becomes a thing. We want to compress as much as we can in this hypervisor host because we want to reduce costs. The DBA team might have availability and data protection as their primary goal, their priority. And the way they would do things would be in alignment with that. So now you have conflicting priorities. And unless you get clear, everybody on the same page, because there will be trade-offs. Like, I cannot afford to achieve higher availability if what you are going to do is you are going to put my databases and my apps on this hypervisor, and all of a sudden performance suffers, or it becomes a single point of failure, right? There will be trade-offs. And most of the time, people would push back on the cost because all they care about is cost reduction. And that's why I encourage technical professionals, and especially decision makers, take a step back. What is the real goal here? Are we trying to build a cluster? Are we building an AG? What is the real goal? Because if you're not clear on the goal, and every team would have different goals, there will be overlaps, there would be misalignment of priorities, there would be confusion to a point where everybody else is doing things differently. And I know I've kind of highlighted some of the examples based on the project that I've worked with in the past, but I recognize it is common. It happens on a regular basis. And that's why it is important to be on the same page, to have a consistent definition, have consistent goal in mind when it comes to designing or even coming up with an HADR solution. It is not a one-man sport or a one-team sport. Everybody has to be on the same page. Besides, if you're a DBA and you're working with SQL Server, no database is an island. It has to be connected to the network. So now you have to talk to your network guys about how they're doing, how they're implementing HA and DR. You would now have to talk to the infrastructure guys and ask them, how are they doing their HA and DR? And also talk to the not vendors, but application developers. How are they achieving high availability and disaster recovery? And how does that look like? You have to synchronize. You have to be on the same page in order for you to come up with an effective HADR solution. Because the last thing you want is to assume and think that a solution actually works. But when a time comes when it is an emergency, and the last thing you want is to test your HADR solutions in an emergency. The last thing you want is for an emergency to happen and none of what you've done actually works. That's one reason why it might be controversial. I don't believe in backups. I believe in successfully making sure that your backups actually work. Because if they don't, we're just wasting CPU cycles, network bandwidth, storage requirements. We're just wasting all of that if the backups are not working, right? And again, we're not just even talking about backups. We're just talking about making sure that everybody is on the same page with what every team. And again, the goal and the role of tech is to serve business and help businesses achieve their goals, right? So it has to be in alignment with that. Different teams might have different priorities and goals. When it comes to high availability and disaster recovery, it has to be consistent across the board. There is no second guessing. This is how we do it. And when a time comes that an emergency happens or an incident happens, everybody knows what to do. Everybody knows what to expect. And I've learned that from a very simple principle, right? I've learned that from a former manager. He said, IT is all about expectation management. All you have to do is manage expectations. But how do you manage expectations if you don't even set the expectations first? And that is what being on the same page with everybody else on the team and with different teams is all about. All right. That wraps up this episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Tune in again next week for another topic. And again, you can watch some of the video recordings of the previous episodes on wherever you're watching this right now. You could be watching it on Twitter, on YouTube, or on LinkedIn. And take notes. It's the things that we do not pay attention to as technical professionals. Again, we're so fixated on, I want to get this thing done. I want to focus on the tech. It's the things that we don't focus on as tech professionals are the ones that actually matter, right? And if you need help with anything, high availability, disaster recovery, maybe it's implementing availability groups, reach out. Use that link on the screen. You would be redirected to my calendar page where you can pick and choose the time that works for you. Reach out. Let's have that conversation. If there is anything I can do to help you mitigate the cost of not being on the same page with your other team members or with the different teams, let me know. And I'll be more than happy to help in any way I can. If not, I will steer you in the direction that will help serve you best, right? Again, use that link on the screen. Let's schedule a strategy talk and let's have that conversation. All right. Tune in again on another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye.